The solitude of the Wyoming high country was Eli Walker's only peace. The year was 1874, and though the war had ended almost a decade ago, its ghosts still followed him. His cabin stood near the Wind River, a squat home of hand-cut logs pressed against a wall of dark pine. He built it alone, built it strong, and built it to keep the world out. Eli was tall and lean, his face roughened by sun and wind, his eyes gray as a storm about to break. His hands were scarred and steady, the hands of a man who had worked, fought, and buried too much. Once they had held a rifle for the Union Army. Now they held only the reins of his horse and the handle of an axe. The quiet life suited him. No towns, no saloons. No questions. Lander, the nearest settlement, was half a day's ride away, and he avoided it whenever he could. Folks there didn't take kindly to men who fought for the North. They called him Yankee, whispered that he was strange, too quiet, too distant. Eli didn't care. He'd seen the worst of men in war. He had no need for their judgment. His world was the river, the mountains, and the whispering wind. That spring had come late, holding onto winter's chill with a mean grip. When the snow on the peaks finally melted, it did so all at once, flooding the valley. The Wind River turned wild and brown, a living beast roaring through the land. Eli watched it from his cabin window, knowing it would wash out the bridge downstream. He'd need to cross at the upper shallows to get supplies. Dangerous, but he was used to danger. He was bent over his horse's hoof, filing a shoe smooth, when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not the cry of a hawk. Not the wind. A scream, high, sharp, and human. He froze, head tilted, every muscle tense. For a heartbeat, he thought it was memory. A voice from some battlefield long gone. But then, it came again, faint, but real. Without a thought, Eli dropped the file and ran. The muddy earth flew beneath his boots as he tore toward the river. The roar grew louder until it filled his chest like thunder. His eyes swept the water, branches, foam, broken logs, and then he saw her. A woman, tangled in a fallen cottonwood, her dark dress caught on its branches, the river beating at her like a fist. He didn't hesitate. He kicked off his boots, ripped off his gun belt, and dove into the freezing torrent. The shock hit him like a punch. The current was a brute, clawing at his legs, dragging him under. He fought it, his arms cutting through the icy water, his eyes locked on the woman. Log slammed his shoulder, but he pushed on, teeth gritted. When he reached her, she was barely conscious. One arm was hooked around a branch, her face pale and slack, her hair plastered dark against her cheeks. The current tried to tear her free. Her leg was caught beneath the tree. Eli grabbed the branch with one hand, anchoring himself. "Hold on!" he shouted, though she couldn't hear. He filled his lungs and went under. The water was black and wild, numbing his fingers as he groped for her trapped leg. His chest burned, his vision sparked, but then he found the branch pinning her and heaved it aside. They shot upward together, breaking the surface in a spray of water and gasps. She was limp in his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder. He dragged her, inch by inch, through the mud and weeds until they collapsed on the bank, both gasping for air. For a moment, neither moved. The river's roar was deafening. Then he rolled toward her, his trembling fingers pressing against her neck. A pulse. Faint, but there. Then a cough, a shudder, and a stream of river water spilled from her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, green, cloudy with fear. "Easy," Eli rasped. "You're safe now." She tried to sit up but fell back, her whole body shaking. Her dress clung to her, torn and soaked, revealing more than modesty allowed. She clutched the fabric around herself, panic flickering across her face. Where am I?" she whispered near the Wind River. "He said, 'My cabin's close.'" "You need warmth." When he reached to help her, she flinched hard, dragging herself backward in the mud like a frightened deer. "Don't take me to town." "Please," Eli paused, confused by the terror in her voice. "Town? he said gruffly. "I'm not taking you to town. But if you stay here, you'll freeze." She stared at him, trembling, searching his face. At last she nodded. When she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. Without a word, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than she looked, fragile as a bird. He carried her into the cabin and set her by the fire. The room smelled of smoke and pine, simple and clean. A single cot, a table, 2 chairs. Solitude in wood and stone. He turned his back and threw more logs on the fire. "Get those wet clothes off," he said. "They'll kill you faster than the river." His tone was rough, but there was no malice in it. She hesitated, clutching the blanket he'd handed her. "Thank you," she murmured. Her voice was hoarse and small. Eli busied himself with the coffee pot, not looking her way. The silence was thick. When he finally turned, she was huddled near the fire, his blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her wet dress draped over the chair to dry. Her dark hair clung to her neck. A bruise marked her cheek. He poured 2 cups of coffee, adding a splash of whiskey to each. "Drink," he said, setting one beside her. She looked up, eyes wary but grateful. "You didn't have to save me." "Yes, I did," he said simply. She gave a faint, sad smile and whispered, "My name is Clara Jensen." "Eli Walker," he replied. For a while, they sat in silence, listening to the river's endless roar. The storm outside had passed, but a different kind of storm was rising in the small cabin. A fragile connection neither of them yet understood. He didn't know who she was or what she was running from, but he could see it. The fear in her eyes was not just from the river. It was the kind born from men and memory. And as he watched her shiver beside his fire, he knew this much was true. The river hadn't brought her here by accident. The fire burned low through the night, throwing long shadows across the cabin walls. Eli lay awake on the floor beside the hearth, his bedroll pulled tight around him. The woman, Clara Jensen, slept on the cot, her breathing shallow but steady. Every so often she stirred, muttering something he couldn't make out, her face twisting in pain, even in dreams. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind batter the shutters. He told himself it was the storm keeping him awake. But it wasn't. It was her. The way she had flinched when he reached for her. The way her voice trembled when she begged not to be taken to town. Something in that fear had settled deep in him, stirring feelings he thought he had buried long ago. When morning came, he was already up, boiling coffee and slicing bacon. The smell filled the small cabin. Clara stirred, blinking against the soft gray light. She looked younger in the morning, less haunted, though her eyes still held a shadow that ran deep. "The river's still high," Eli said, handing her a steaming cup. "No chance of crossing for a few days." Quote. She nodded, taking the cup in both hands, grateful for its warmth. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll be gone as soon as it's safe," he grunted. "Suit yourself." She hesitated, watching him. "You live out here all alone. I prefer it that way." There was silence again, the kind that stretched long but didn't yet feel awkward. She sipped her coffee, her gaze fixed on the fire. "My husband," she began, then stopped. Her fingers tightened around the cup. "He passed a few months ago, left debts, bad ones. Men came to collect what wasn't theirs to take." Eli didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew the kind of men she meant. He'd seen them in every frontier town. Men who smiled while they broke things that didn't belong to them. "I packed what I could and left before sunrise," she continued. Her voice barely more than a whisper. "I thought I could make it across before the river rose." "I was wrong," he nodded slowly. "You're lucky I heard you." "Maybe not luck," she said softly, her eyes drifting to the fire. "Maybe just mercy." They spent the next few days trapped by the flooded river. The cabin became a fragile island in a world of mud and noise. Clara moved about quietly, always trying to be useful. She washed the dishes, tidied the small space, even mended one of his shirts. Eli told her she didn't need to, but she only said, "It helps me forget." By the third day, the rhythm between them had changed. He'd grown used to the sound of her soft footsteps, the way she hummed to herself when she worked. But it also unsettled him, the way her presence filled the silence he had once thought he wanted. Late one afternoon, he came in from chopping wood and found her sitting by the table, her face hidden behind her hands. Her shoulders were shaking. On the table lay an open silver locket, its small chain tangled. Eli stopped at the door, unsure what to do. He wasn't good with words, never had been. But seeing her cry twisted something inside him. He made a quiet sound to announce himself. She straightened instantly, wiping at her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "It's nothing. Just a foolish memory." He nodded, pretending to believe her, but his eyes flicked to the locket. "Someone you lost." She hesitated, then whispered, "My son." He would have been 2 years old. The words hung between them like smoke. Eli said nothing, just looked at her. And she looked back, as if waiting for judgment. But there was none in his face, only a quiet sorrow that matched her own. That night, the wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls. The fire sputtered low, and Clara began to shiver despite the blankets. When Eli checked her forehead, it was hot. Too hot. "Fever, you're burning up," he said, reaching for a basin. "It's just the chill," she whispered, trying to sit up. "Lie down." He ordered. His voice was rough, but his hands were careful as he pressed a cool rag against her brow. Through the long hours of the night, he stayed beside her, changing the cloth, feeding the fire, whispering words he didn't know he remembered. Near dawn, she stirred, her voice weak and slurred. "You're kind, Mr. Walker," she murmured, eyes half open. "You're the only man who's ever touched me without wanting something." The words stopped his breath. He froze, his hands still on her forehead. Her fevered confession hit him harder than any bullet could. She wasn't just running from debts, she was running from cruelty. From men who took and took until there was nothing left. He sat there until the fire burned down to embers, listening to her restless sleep, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Anger, sorrow, and something softer he didn't dare name. When morning came, the fever broke. She woke pale but alive, her eyes clearer than before. Eli smiled faintly, a rare thing for him. "You made it through," he said quietly. She managed a weak smile. "Thanks to you." Outside, the river had begun to calm. Soon she would be able to leave, but as Eli looked at her, frail yet unbroken, wrapped in his old army blanket, he realized he wasn't ready for that silence to return. And he wondered, with a confusion that both frightened and warmed him, if she felt the same. Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. The morning light poured through the cracks in the cabin walls, soft and golden. The river's roar had quieted to a low murmur, and for the first time in days, the air smelled of pine instead of mud. Clara sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She looked fragile but alive, a small spark of color back in her cheeks. Eli was outside splitting logs. His movements were slow, deliberate, his thoughts heavy. He knew she could leave now. The river was calm enough to cross, and she had every reason to go. But the idea of that empty cabin without her, the quiet returning like a weight, made his chest ache in a way he didn't understand. When he came back inside, she was standing by the window, staring out at the river. "It's strange," she said softly. "It almost looks gentle now." "It always does," he replied, "until it takes something from you." She turned to face him. "You lost someone too, didn't you?" Eli froze. For a moment, the old pain surfaced, the faces, the letters, the promises that never came true. "My brother," he said finally. "And the woman I was supposed to marry. War took one, time took the other." Clara's eyes softened. "Then maybe we're the same kind of broken." He didn't answer, but something in his chest shifted. Days passed. The river continued to fall, but Clara didn't leave. She said she was still weak, and he didn't argue. She began to cook again, filling the cabin with smells he hadn't known in years. Fresh bread, hot stew. She hummed while she worked, a quiet tune that seemed to push back the ghosts. And yet, something else had begun to grow in that small space, an invisible tension that neither of them could ignore. Every glance, every accidental brush of hands carried an unspoken question. One evening, after supper, she stood near the table, folding his washed clothes. The firelight painted her skin in gold. She moved slowly, her limp barely noticeable now. Eli sat across the room, sharpening his knife, pretending not to watch her. But he couldn't stop. When she turned, she caught his gaze. Neither looked away. "You saved me," she said quietly. "Twice, maybe more. You don't owe me anything." "I didn't say I did." Her voice was soft but steady. She took a small step closer. "But you never let me thank you." He set the knife down. His hands were still Clara. He began, but she interrupted him. "Look at me, Eli." He did. Slowly. Her hands moved to the buttons of the old army shirt she was wearing, the one he'd lent her after the fever. Her fingers trembled, but her voice didn't. "Will you stay if I undress?" she asked. The words hit him like a thunderclap. For a heartbeat, the cabin fell silent. The fire cracked once, the only sound between them. She wasn't teasing, and she wasn't begging. She was standing before him, stripped of pride, of shame, of everything but truth. He stood up, his jaw tight, his breath unsteady. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she whispered. "I just don't want to be afraid anymore." Her voice broke on the last word. The blanket slid from her shoulders, and she stood there trembling, not from cold, but from all she had carried alone. Eli stepped forward, slow and careful. He lifted her chin, his calloused fingers brushing her tear-wet cheek. "You don't need to prove anything to me," he said softly. "You're already the bravest woman I've ever known." For a long moment they stood in silence. Then, gently, he pulled her into his arms. She pressed her face against his chest and finally began to sob, not from fear, but release. When she could speak again, her voice was barely a whisper. "He hurt me," she said. "My husband. He hurt me, and I thought that was all I was worth." Eli tightened his hold, his voice low and steady. "That ends here." The storm that had raged inside her for years began to quiet. She felt his warmth, his strength, his steady heartbeat. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt safe. In the days that followed, their bond deepened. He worked the land. She kept the home. They didn't talk about love. They didn't need to. It showed in the way he brought her wildflowers without a word, and the way she mended his shirt even when the seams were fine. When danger came again, it came from the world outside. Her late husband's brother, Amos Jensen, rode into town spreading lies. He claimed Clara had stolen from him, that she'd run off with another man. By the time word reached Eli's cabin, a small posse was already forming. Eli saddled his horse. "We'll go to town," he said. "Tell the truth to the sheriff." But the sheriff didn't believe them. He believed Amos, the man with money, the man with connections. He called Clara a thief, a liar, a woman of poor reputation. Eli's hands clenched into fists. "You don't know her," he said, his voice cold as iron. The sheriff sneered. "I know her kind." That was enough. Eli grabbed Clara's hand and pulled her out of the office. They rode hard into the hills, chased by more than dust. That night, they hid in an old barn miles from town. The wind howled through the cracks. Clara sat trembling, her face buried in her hands. "He'll never stop, Eli," she whispered. "He'll find me." Eli knelt beside her and lifted her chin. "Then he'll have to go through me first." Her eyes filled with tears, not from fear this time, but from something stronger. "Why would you risk everything for me?" He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Because I already lost too much once. I'm not losing you too." She leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't desperate. It was real, raw, and full of every word they hadn't said. They returned to town the next morning with Judge Miller, the only man of true honor in that place. The judge listened to their story, and for the first time, justice leaned their way. Amos and his men were arrested for assault and lies. Weeks later, when Eli was healed from the fight that nearly took his life, He stood beside Clara by the Wind River, the same river where he had first found her. The water was calm now, shining under the summer sun. "I never thanked you," she said. "You already did," he replied with a faint smile. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with hope. "Then let me ask you something new." She took a slow breath, her voice trembling, but sure. "Will you stay now?" Eli reached for her hand, his rough fingers curling around hers. "For the rest of my days," he said. And there, on the riverbank that had nearly claimed her life, the cowboy and the widow began anew, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two souls who had finally found home in each other.